As we continue to go through the different groups of organic compounds, those that contain carbon and are important to living things, we're going to lump two together in this particular episode because the first, which you see here in front of you, nucleic acids, is going to be a very small section. It's not because that these molecules aren't important, but because these very much relate to the idea of genetics and heredity, and we're going to spend a ton of time on those things later. We're going to just hit some highlights here and then move on to another organic group. So as I was saying, nucleic acids, represented here by RNA on the left and DNA on the right. Those sets of letters stand for ribonucleic acid and deoxyribonucleic acid. Thus the Na is in the title there. As is the case with all the different organic groups that we're talking about, one of the most important points to make is the composition of its monomer. The monomer, the basic unit that makes up these polymers, in this case would be a nucleotide. So a monomer of either DNA or RNA is referred to as a nucleotide. That nucleotide has a few basic parts. You can see the phosphate, a pentose sugar, and probably most importantly, what's called a nitrogenous base. But basically here, you need to know the term nucleotide. In order to take those monomers and join them together to make a polymer, you'll make your DNA or your RNA. The picture here shows you DNA, and if you look closely, you can see each of the monomers. So here is a phosphate, a pentose sugar, and one of those nitrogenous bases. And so there is a nucleotide. It's attached to another nucleotide below it and is attached to another nucleotide on the opposite side of the structure. When it comes to DNA and RNA, their basic importance and function is that they are a code that is ultimately used to produce the fourth of our organic groups, that being the proteins. A little bit different situation here. We talked about carbs containing carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We talked about lipids containing carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Proteins too contain those three elements, but they also contain the fourth element, nitrogen. We are largely composed of protein, our muscles, our skin, etc. But the most important thing here, as mentioned earlier, you've got to know the monomer. The monomer of a protein is called an amino acid. And if we take a closer look at that, we can see the chemical structure of a generic amino acid pictured here. Now let's start here in the center. As all organic molecules do, there is an atom of carbon. Okay, here is a central atom of carbon. And of course, carbon has 4 covalent bonds sticking out in each direction. Every amino acid has a hydrogen as part of one of those 4 bonds. So when we look at that central carbon atom, one of the things that's always bonded to it in every amino acid is a hydrogen. What's also bonded to it every time, if we look over here to the right, is this big structure here of a carbon with 2 oxygens and a hydrogen. That is referred to as a carboxyl group, that whole entity right there. So radiating out from that central carbon, we have a hydrogen on one side, we've got a carboxyl group on the other, and if we look to the left here, we have a group of 1 nitrogen and 2 hydrogens, which collectively represent something called an amino group, which is of course how an amino acid gets its name. So again, central carbon, we've got a hydrogen, we've got a carboxyl group, we've got an amino group. Every amino acid has those features. The variance comes here. You'll notice something here referred to as the R group. The R is just a variable. Different chemical combinations can be attached to that R, or in place of that R. Whatever else happens to be there, whatever this R represents makes the amino acids different from each other. For instance, there's an amino acid called leucine. Well, it has a certain combination of atoms attached here that would be different than something like tryptophan, which is another amino acid. So every different type of amino acid, and there's about 20 of them, has this central carbon, this carboxyl group, this hydrogen, and this amino group. But what makes one amino acid different from another is whatever combination of atoms get attached down here in what is referred to as the R. Proteins are just a bunch of amino acids all linked into a chain. And so, as has been discussed now several times, how do we take smaller organic molecules, like amino acids, and link them together into long chains? Of course, the answer at this point, I hope you know, is dehydration synthesis. You've seen this pictured with other organic substances. Now we can do it with the proteins. Here is one amino acid. Here is another amino acid. If you want to link them together in order to form a protein, take an H and an H and an O, and you remove them to form a water molecule. And that means that this carbon is now missing a bond, and this nitrogen is now missing a bond because these things have been removed. And so this carbon bonds to this nitrogen, which is what you're seeing right there. And there is the water molecule, the two H's and the O's that were formed as a result of removing those from above. What that leads us to is going to be a separate topic. As I mentioned earlier, proteins make up your skin and proteins make up your muscle. And those certainly have their structural components to your body as well as functional components within your body. But there is one category of proteins that sort of is set aside from all the others in that they are completely functional, not structural. They don't compose your body, but they serve an important role in your body and how your body works. And that grouping, that subgrouping of proteins is known as enzymes. And the enzymes are going to get their own description, their own video.